Good afternoon. My name is Janie Montblanc with the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange, and with me is John Tull, Acting Sagebrush Ecosystem Coordinator with the U.S. Geological Survey Land Management Research Program, and Corey Gooker, Great Basin Fire Science Exchange Co-Coordinator. We'd like to welcome you to this second webinar in the Sagebrush Ecosystem Restoration and Fire Science series on the topics of wildlife, carbon, grazing, and fuel breaks, presented by USGS researchers. John Toll will be our host today, but before I hand the webinar over to him, I'll go over some webinar details. We're using Zoom Meeting as our platform with attendees' mics and cameras off as you enter the webinar. We'll take a couple of questions between each presentation and save the rest for after all the presentations. So you can type in your questions in the chat and I'll field them, or you can unmute yourself and ask aloud. One last item of business is that the last talk today on post-fire grazing resumption guidance is canceled, and we're hoping to reschedule it for next Tuesday or Wednesday's sessions. So with that, I'll hand it over to John.
Thank you, Janae. I appreciate it and appreciate all your support. So I wanted to point out that this webinar series has been an ongoing collaboration that's primarily with the BLM, but also with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and some other key partners. Our goal in SERF is to provide meaningful and actionable science for our partners. And these webinars provide us a really critical tech transfer opportunity to bring our researchers to the community and practitioners and allow all of you to ask questions about some of the work. We probably won't be able to get to everyone's questions during the formatted time that we have allotted, but encourage you all to reach out and follow up as needed, and we will make sure that your questions are answered. So with that, I'll go ahead and move into our session today, and our first speaker is going to be Seren Bagcilar, who's talking about decadal effects of fuel treatments and annual grass invasion on sagebrush ecosystem carbon stocks. So Seren, I can see you.
Great. Thanks
for
share. Looking good.
And we see your slides. Take it away.
All right. Great. Here. All right. Yeah, thanks. I'm Seren. I'm a biologist with USGS based in Reno, Nevada. And yeah, excited to talk to you today about fuel treatment and cheatgrass effects in sagebrush ecosystems. So this work is part of SageSteppe, the Sagebrush Steppe Treatment Evaluation Project, which is a partner in collaboration with these logos here. And then funding for this work in particular comes from the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Northwest Cask. So the sagebrush biome covers a vast spatial extent, and with that stores a vast amount of carbon. And when we think about where that carbon is stored, this very simplified diagram here, there's carbon within plant biomass above and below ground, and also any litter that would be accumulating on the ground surface. But the majority of that sagebrush ecosystem carbon is stored below ground. And that soil carbon is associated with some critical ecosystem services like increased water holding capacity and nutrient retention. But as we know, sagebrush ecosystems are changing rapidly. And a few drivers of that change include things like conifer expansion, annual grass invasion, and increased wildfire risk, due in part to both conifer and annual grass cover increasing. And in addition, fuel treatments that are implemented over large spatial scales throughout the sagebrush biome to increase sagebrush ecosystem resiliency can also act as a driver of change themselves. But we're still learning a lot about the impacts of all of these changes on ecosystem carbon storage. And in the work I'm talking about today, we sought to determine the impacts of these two changes, annual grass invasion and fuel treatments, on sagebrush ecosystem carbon storage. And so to do that, we use data from SageSteppe, the Sagebrush Steppe Treatment Evaluation Project, which includes a series of sites from throughout the US Intermountain West. and includes a series of woodland sites and shrubland sites, the woodland sites experiencing some degree of conifer encroachment. And at each of those sites, a control for the woodlands, a control, a prescribed fire, and a cut and drop treatment was applied. And then in the shrubland sites, control, prescribed fire, mowing, and a woody herbicide was applied. And then the data that was collected before and 10 years after treatment was above ground biomass, which we converted to carbon, biomass collected through a series of measurements, weighing herbaceous matter, allometric equations, vegetation cover from line point intercept, and soil carbon that we got from 90 centimeter interspace soil cores collected in 15 centimeter increments. So what did we find? This first image I'm bringing up is a lot, but it shows a really broad overview of our kind of whole carbon inventory. So the figure depicts above ground and below ground carbon stocks for each carbon pool, which there are many of, and you certainly can't parse out the different colors in this image, before at year 0 and after at year 10, each treatment for the woodland and the shrubland sites. And so clearly, probably the one thing you can really see is that most carbon is stored in our 2 soil carbon pools, yellow and orange, for soil organic and inorganic carbon. And just as a reminder, if you haven't thought about soil inorganic carbon in a while, we're talking about carbonate minerals that form through chemical weathering and reactions below ground and can accumulate in drylands, as opposed to soil organic carbon that originates from plant and microbial activity and inputs. But if we zoom into these above ground pools, we can start to see a little bit more of what's going on. And we can see that treatments generally reduced our above ground carbon stocks, which is to be expected. But it's harder to pick out treatment effects below ground in those kind of yellow and orange columns moving down from the x-axis. And there were, in fact, no treatment effects that we could detect on soil organic or inorganic carbon. And worth noting that what we're looking at here represents the full 0 to 90 centimeter soil cores, but we weren't also able to really reliably pick out treatment effects with depth either. So soil carbon stocks were pretty resistant to sort of direct fuel treatment effects, which is potentially a good outcome for managers, as it seems kind of increasingly likely that fuel treatments can sort of go on to meet these important ecosystem objectives with a minimal risk for soil carbon storage. But how did soil carbon stocks hold up against widespread cheatgrass invasion that was occurring sort of somewhat uniformly throughout the treatment network? So to address that, we looked for correlations between 10-year soil organic or inorganic carbon change, which is what's on the y-axis in these plots, and 10-year annual grass cover change in shallow 0 to 30 centimeter and deep 30 to 90 centimeter soils. And we found that we could kind of summarize our findings well by grouping the data into shallow and deep in this way. That also has ecological relevance, as cheatgrass roots would be expected to kind of be concentrated in those top 30 centimeters. Soil inorganic carbon would be concentrated below. So yeah, made sense. And what did we kind of expect to see? Starting with organic carbon, which goes across the top row here, we hypothesized negative effects of cheatgrass invasion that would be most noticeable in deeper soils. And that was largely because if we have the replacement of perennial deep rooting species with annual shallow rooting grasses, we're removing our deeper points of soil organic carbon input in the soil, which can lead to the depletion of those deep soil organic carbon pools over time. And we ended up seeing that negative correlation in the woodland network. To know more concretely exactly why this occurred and if the mechanism we hypothesized was truly responsible for that, microsite sampling would have been helpful for this. Just a reminder that we're using interspace soil cores here. but still interesting and generally supportive of the hypothesis and kind of a growing consensus in the literature on this. And it certainly doesn't mean that there was no cheatgrass effect or correlation in the shrubland deep soils. We just weren't quite able to support that with our data. And I think part of this is likely just because the woodland sites were generally in cooler, moister locations and kind of just had more of everything to start. So more perennial cover, more soil carbon, and so potentially more carbon to lose, which may have helped make that trend a little bit easier to identify given other study limitations. Soil inorganic carbon is trickier, particularly because we often think of it as changing on more geologic timescales, while mechanisms of change on management relevant timescales are still sort of unknown. And so we didn't have a clear hypothesis going into this about what to expect, but we were curious to see what we could find, given that soil inorganic carbon makes up such a huge component of dryland carbon stocks, and given some recent work that suggested that the acidifying effect that cheatgrass can have on soils can potentially lead to soil inorganic carbon loss. And we found this interesting negative correlation in deeper soils of the shrubland network here. So again, not particularly able to pick out any mechanism of soil inorganic carbon loss, whether it was loss to the atmosphere or sort of a movement within the soils laterally downward, kind of remains unknown. But this is an interesting finding that adds to a small but growing, maybe a body of literature with experimental evidence of this correlation between annual grass and soil inorganic carbon loss. Right, so just some quick takeaways here. I think that the outcomes that land managers already aim for, such as preventing large wildfires and conversion to annual grassland, are also likely to protect ecosystem carbon storage by keeping sagebrush ecosystems intact. And soil carbon loss with regional cheatgrass invasion could overshadow any fuel treatment effects in the long term, given that there were these negative correlations with invasion and no detectable treatment level effects. But again, just kind of bringing in this caveat that we didn't have the microsite sampling that may have sort of impacted how treatments appeared. Right, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Seren. I just want to remind folks that they can type questions in the chat, or if you want, you can come on camera and go ahead and ask a question if anyone has one. Well, Saren, so we've been trying to think about carbon storage and the potential of shrubland ecosystems, and I think that was a real driver of this. The need for this project was really trying to have better accounting for how sagebrush shrublands may or may not be useful in those paradigms. What's your general thinking about shrublands and carbon storage and maybe credit systems that people might be thinking of towards management of greenhouse gases?
Yeah, I guess I don't know too much about the credit potential, but I will say that I think an important element of this work that I didn't talk too much on, just because it's sort of a big table, is that kind of pretty comprehensive ecosystem carbon inventory. Because as we all know, sagebrush ecosystems are super variable. And so a lot of the estimates out there vary a lot too. And it's nice to kind of get sort of the large spatial scale inventory element here that can help sort of refine those estimates, which is always useful for that sort of thing. So I think that's a sort of a strong suit of this, is all of their variability that exists. And yeah, and this work was recently accepted to Ecosphere, and so if interested, people can look out for that and see all of the sort of tables and budgeting components to this too.
I think we got time for one more question. There's one in the chat. I don't know if you can see it. That first one from Roger, and we'll have to answer the other one in the chat. What about soil structure when cheatgrass dominates for 10 years?
So I guess, is that question asking if we've sort of shifted to under cheatgrass dominance for a prolonged period of time, does that start to impact soil structure? I guess I don't have a perfect answer for that. For the work that we had, there was like a texture analysis and things like that that were mostly done for just the pretreatment year. And then we sort of assumed that there weren't major structural differences in that 10-year time frame. I think for the most part, we would be looking at slightly longer timescales for that.
Okay, great. Well, Saren, there's a few more questions you can answer in the chat, and
Okay.
in the interest of time, we're going to move on to our next talk. So Jason Kreitler is going to present information on unmanned AS. Oh, I should have asked you this beforehand. Aerial systems survey of sagebrush field. Drones surveying of sagebrush field break. So, Jason, take it away. Sorry about that.
No worries. Thanks, John.
Here you see, and you got your slides, so it's all yours.
Okay, of course, everything shifted around, so now I don't see myself. My name is Jason Kreitler. I'm a research geographer, Western Geographic Science Center. I sit here in Boise, Idaho, and I'm fortunate to be a colleague of Doug Shinneman, who's an ecologist here in Boise, and Taylor, who's a hydrologist here with Idaho Water Science Center. We're the primary collaborators on this project, looking using uncrewed aerial systems to survey field break conditions. And this will all be in the big desert field break area that's south of Arco, Idaho, if you know where that is. So what are we doing here? Field break monitoring with UAS. This project came about as a question of, what could we use our USGS UAS capacity to tell about vegetation monitoring in sagebrush rangelands. So what we're able to do with the sensors aboard our UAS are generate things like 2 centimeter RGB and multispectral uh, images, so extremely high resolution. We can also use those same image sources and through the process called structure from motion generate surface and canopy models. So essentially generating a canopy model of the sagebrush ecosystem, understanding, kind of the height and the vertical as well as the kind of horizontal heterogeneity amongst all of these areas that the BLM and other partners are putting in to make the sagebrush ecosystem potentially more resilient to wildland fire. So with that data, we're then able to classify the imagery using some AI and ML methods. And then we'll presumably scale up everything to get at some questions of scale, as far as we're not going to produce 2 centimeter vegetation models across the entire Great Basin, but or even our study area, but to try and understand some of those questions of scale, the classic landscape ecology questions of, well, what scale do you need to really characterize the landscape according to the land management questions that you have. We did this in 2024 in the summer with 2 flights designed specifically to capture the phenological change associated with cheatgrass in the area. So this is just an example of flight planning software that the Wingtra UAS uses. And the takeaway here is that we are we're flying at 300 feet above the ground. You kind of generate a flight plan and do all these kind of back and forth to cover the area of interest. And this fixed wing is interesting because it's vertical takeoff and landing, so it's easier to use than some of the other fixed wing that you had to kind of throw into the air or that need a long runway. This just kind of takes off like a helicopter. And then once it gets to its altitude, pivots and flies back and forth as long as it has endurance. We were able to do, over 150 acres in about 25 minutes. This is all very dependent on weather and wind, but it's a really interesting platform and can carry a reasonable sized payload for a decent amount of time. So what can we generate with this? This is I'll go through this quickly, but the top image is kind of zoomed in RGB imagery, and that is a 1 by 1 meter quadrat that we place out there so that we know and we go visit that quadrat and sample vegetation. The yellow line is a kind of a cross section that you'll see in the bottommost picture, and that illustrates the structure from motion, kind of a canopy, the vertical data that we get from that structure from motion process. So that allows us to measure the height of sagebrush canopy. And with that, we can go over and look in the right-hand image. And here I put that through a segmentation algorithm and essentially draws polygons around all the sagebrush grounds. So if there's ever a need to count all the sagebrush canopies and within a certain area, then we could do that. That's of interest. Scaling out. This is that canopy model. And one of the interesting things, the features that you start to see are one, the road is really apparent, and then the drainage ditches are two vehicles. But then you should be able to see kind of the variation within the field break area and outside the field break area that really, you know, it's a pretty clear field break area. So hopefully that's obvious. And what we can, again, on any given transect, kind of show what the change between the field break and the kind of unmanaged area outside the field break, what that vertical structure looks like. We can also look closely at the composition of the vegetation within our flight areas. So on the left hand, I'm showing you a picture taken from, head high, looking out, and on the right-hand side, that's the photo direction. These are the same areas, and the black outline is a polygon that I walked around that was a heavily infested cheatgrass area, and then layered on top of that, that yellow to red to purple is a layer that we use to really make the cheatgrass areas pop, and that is a differenced NDVI image. So when we went out in June, the cheatgrass was nice and green, and then when we came back in July, it hit senesced, and it looked like that picture on the left. When you subtract those two, it creates a data layer that's very highly correlated with cheatgrass presence, and it's one of the layers that we use to identify different vegetation types. We also put quadrants down and sample vegetation. And so this is an example of looking at the imagery very zoomed in on the left, and then looking at the picture of that quadrat on the right. And those two red areas are the same spot on the Earth. So just interesting to kind of calibrate our own minds when we're trying to train these models back in the office. And we do that with a number of different techniques, but one that's really cool is this this way to segment imagery. So these two image chips are the same spot the same image. On the left, this is the outcome of essentially digitizing all those little polygons surrounding the sagebrush grounds, and the tool kind of helps you out, and you kind of click on one area and it says, oh, these are all the same. So it kind of manually, or it automatically delineates the individual sagebrush and rabbitbrush and lupin crowns, and then the litters, the tan color in there. So we use all those chips to feed into the machine learning models to classify the larger image. So this is all done in Python with different AI ML models in like a Python notebook for those who care. But it's a really nice way to kind of make iterative progress and be able to hand that progress off to any of your team, and then do extremely reproducible science for this type of analysis. And then finally, if we compare the results of some of those models, we're doing pretty well without a ton of effort put in so far. An overall accuracy of 96 to 94% is pretty good. This is on a kind of independent validation data set. And we're, essentially able to differentiate the annual grasses and the rabbitbrush and sagebrush, and other perennials pretty well, and the background kind of dirt and litter and the rocks out there. What we're doing next is to kind of address some of those questions of scale. So we're not going to hand the BLM the 2 centimeter vegetation model and say, we solved it for you. But to address those questions of scale and trade-offs with actually going out to fly and using that data to generate additional models using, for example, Planet, which is 3 meter, or Sentinel, or Landsat data, and to say something about kind of what is best, what kind of platform would be best for monitoring of field break conditions. Also to do potentially some fire simulation modeling and take our data and compare it to, for example, land fire, and then see the variation among fire simulation outputs to see if, what's being missed using kind of coarse data compared to RCMap and some of the really cool kind of weekly products that Matt's producing there. And then finally to internally to kind of understand what we can and can't do and make marginal improvements on our UAS methods for the DOI and the USGS. That's what I have. And with that, I'll try and take questions, although it's kind of blind. Everything disappeared for me.
Great, Jason. Thank you. No, that was real good. If you can turn your slides off if you prefer, that's fine. I don't see any questions in the chat just yet. Again, people are welcome to turn on their camera if you have one. I've got a couple. You mentioned briefly there that you worked with Matthew Riggi at Eros. And so I was curious, has he taken some of this really fine scale data to do some recalibration work on the RC map classifications? Or is it really too limited of a geography to be useful for him at this point? And would it need to be expanded?
Sure. We haven't. Of course, I would talk to him whenever. And but that is some of the question, not to say like, oh, he's getting it wrong, but to say, well, how much variation is there among, a 30-meter pixel?
Mm-hmm.
At what point does it, especially with like landfire, there might be 4 fuel models out there. I'm like, well, how much variation is there among those 4 grass and shrub fuel models?
Yeah, no, I think
How
that's
much bare dirt, how much, some of the sagebrush is this high and some of it is, ankle high.
No, it's an incredible data set you guys have. I'm sure there's lots of other good uses you guys will be able to exploit it for. There was one more question we'll take in the chat before moving on from Keaton Martin that says that asks you, is the end goal for the data invasive annual grass management within the fuel break area and to avoid encroachment in the shrub step? So is that a component or even an end goal? I was wondering the same, like classifying how much invasion's in those fuel breaks.
I think it's not an end goal. The intent was to kind of figure out a way and to see if this would be useful for monitoring.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the BLM certainly anybody would be certainly interested in understanding how much, for example, cheatgrass is invaded in there, and especially when you can do it, with pretty high accuracy and get both kind of the density and total cover.
Yeah.
And we did design it partly to have a couple different sites that would capture kind of a range and variation.
Well, thanks a lot, Jason. That was great. I think there's some other follow-ups in the chat, at least one, and I'm sure there'll be more. With that, we'll move on to Martin Holdrege, and Martin's going to share the work that he's helping lead up on livestock grazing for climate adaptation in drylands leads to trade-offs between fire and vegetation condition. So Martin, I saw you. I see your slides. Let's see if we hear you.
Thanks, John.
I hear you.
Great. So I'm Martin Holdrege. I'm an ORISE postdoc with the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And what I'm going to be talking about today has been kind of an effort between USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service folks, as well as some university researchers as well. And we've been trying to understand how grazing might be used as a tool to help mitigate fire issues in sagebrush ecosystems while also considering some potential trade-offs as far as other impacts on vegetation. So I think probably a lot of you have seen these two maps on the left, showing in dark blue these core sagebrush areas, the most intact kind of sagebrush ecosystems, and how they've declined over the last couple of decades, in large part due to things like continued invasion by annual grasses. And then the map on the right is showing some work that we've done trying to understand what the future trajectory might be under climate change. And it suggests that climate is likely to exacerbate some of the challenges we have, with continued invasion of grasses, annual grasses, or declines in sagebrush, again, leading to potential more losses of core sagebrush, at least in some areas. And so for this work, we're kind of thinking about two important related variables in sagebrush. The one being how much is burning, how much wildfire we have, and the other being sagebrush ecological integrity, which those maps were based off of. And so if we're in some kind of a landscape, we might have a given combination of those two variables right now. And then the question is, how does that change in the future? And with potential drivers like climate change, continued invasion by annual grasses, and the annual grass fire cycle, things could move up and to the left, meaning more fire and lower ecological integrity. And ideally, we'd have some kind of a management intervention that's able to counteract some of those forces. And we're exploring grazing because it's obviously very widespread in sagebrush, making it a potentially useful tool, a viable tool, with cows being able to graze, reduce fine fuel loads, reduce invasive annual grass abundance. But there's also the potential to reduce the abundance of desirable plant groups, perennial grasses and so forth, which could also reduce sagebrush ecological integrity. And so that means there's a potential for some sort of a trade-off. So in this kind of cartoon version of the figure, we're going from a light grazing to a heavy grazing intensity, and that's both bringing down fire, but also ecological integrity, again, leading to a potential trade-off. So with the work that we're doing, we're trying to answer three related questions. The first being, what is the long-term impact of grazing on vegetation and sagebrush ecological integrity? Second, how and where can changing the intensity of grazing be used to reduce fire? And this is thinking about both current and future conditions. And then lastly, what is the trade-off between those two things? So the trade-off between the potentially positive impacts of increased grazing for mitigating fire, but also potentially negative impacts if we're degreasing the biomass of some of the desirable plants. And we have a draft of a manuscript that's kind of detailing these and going into more of the spatial results than I'll be showing here today. Please reach out if you want to see that. But I'm going to be focusing on the third question that sort of ties things together. So I'm going to be real brief on the methods, but overall, sagebrush ecological integrity is calculated as a function of the amount of sagebrush and perennials, which positively impact this index, and the abundance of annuals, conifers, and human modification, which negatively impact it. And so these are based on remote sensing data products. And then we're projecting SCI for different scenarios. And we're doing that by modifying the remote sensing inputs using simulation modeling. So we're simulating how the cover of sagebrush, perennials, and annuals might change under different levels of grazing, as well as different climate intensity, different climate futures. And so now to dig into the results, we broke up the sagebrush biome kind of into four regions here. And first, we're focusing on the upper left and looking at just places that are currently core sagebrush, so the best, highest ecosystem integrity right now. And in those places, when we go from a lighter grazing intensity in the yellow to a heavy grazing intensity in the dark red, we're getting a decline, kind of expected, but decline in the amount of projected burned area. And overall, we're then also seeing that sagebrush ecological integrity does decline somewhat as we get to heavier intensities of grazing. And it's sort of at the moderate grazing, we have maybe a little bit of an optimum where we've reduced fire somewhat, but SEI is still high. In that case, we've reduced the abundance of some of the cheatgrass through grazing, but we've also not hammered the perennial grasses too hard. And then we're also trying to think about what this trade-off might look like under the future conditions. And so then the dark line, we're now showing future climate, and that relationship is more or less the same, but everything's moved up and to the left, meaning a little more fire and lower ecological integrity on average in those same areas. And we're now also looking at, in the two other remaining colors, looking at places that are currently growth opportunity areas, so kind of an intermediate ecological integrity, and other rangeland areas in tan. And there, those trends are more vertical. So as we increase grazing intensity, we're bringing down fire, but we're also having only a pretty limited impact on sagebrush ecological integrity. That doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't negative impacts of that heavier grazing. It's just we're not capturing it in this metric. So things like impacts on biological soil crusts or something would not be captured. And then if we're looking at the Southern Great Basin, it's overall a similar story. The slopes are a little bit shallower. Overall, we're simulating a little bit less fire in those places. So the impact on fire is a little bit smaller relative to the impacts on SEI. And then it's a very different story in the eastern half of the biome, where we have, on average, much lower fire frequencies. So the impact on fire is pretty limited. And so this kind of idea of the trade-off is perhaps a little bit less relevant in those places that have much lower baseline levels of fire, both currently and in the future. So I think overall, at least in places where we have pretty frequent fires, we're getting this kind of overall trade-off where we get a decline in burned area with this heavier grazing. And what we're representing in this study, and this kind of first pass of this question, has been just a traditional grazing regime. And kind of a question is, how could this relationship change, or could it change with a different grazing regime, with a targeted grazing regime? And that's something that our colleague Kyle Palmquist is starting to work on, pulling together results from targeted grazing studies to try to address that a little bit more. And so kind of to summarize the main results, I think overall we're seeing this general trade-off where grazing can be effective for reducing wildfire, but there can also be impacts on ecological integrity. But importantly, this trade-off does vary a lot regionally. But I think more broadly, the idea could still hold in similar systems where maybe you're not considering SEI as the metric you care about, but that there are some of these trade-offs when thinking about managing fire using grazing. Of course, limitations do exist in how we're defining it and how we're estimating. For example, that SEI doesn't capture everything we might care about in these ecosystems. But I think the results aren't so much meant to be able to give an optimum grazing intensity, but more at kind of regional or sub-regional levels, give managers kind of some of the pictures of things to consider with these potential trade-offs. And that's kind of important just because grazing is already so commonly used on the landscape, meaning it's a potentially important and practical climate adaptation tool in these systems. And that's it for me, but please reach out if you have any questions.
Great, Martin. Thank you. I was looking at the chat. There was some one comment about that ecological integrity, and I think you touched on that at the end. But you could expand if you want on again the the ecological integrity versus what someone at a more like fine scale might be thinking about.
Yeah, right. So I think that maybe the concept would be the same, but yes, whether the reason that we're using sagebrush ecological integrity for this is A, it's already being used in sagebrush, but B, it's kind of it integrates multiple things we care about, but obviously not all of them. So either you could have an index that integrates more things like the multiple soil health, biocrust, etc., or you'd have to look at this for multiple different variables that you care about, which might be a deeper dive and beyond what we'd be able to model in our current approach. But I think if you're actually considering it for a given plot of land, you would need to be thinking about more of those other variables that we're obviously not capturing here. Yeah.
Well, real quick, there's one more question that came up in the chat if you want to look at that and read that first part of it out.
How are the effects of grazing on annual and perennial herbaceous and sagebrush shrubs estimated? Yeah, so we're using a simulation model where we're simulating the plant community, meaning like just the few key plant functional groups, perennial grasses, sagebrush, annuals, perennial forbs as well. And we're then with the different grazing intensities, we're simulating a fixed fraction of removal, so fixed utilization. And so each year we have, for light grazing, it's 24%, for the moderate grazing, it's 41%, and so on. So just a range of utilizations that occur every year. So it's simplified in that case that we have perfectly consistent percent utilizations. And then that carries on by, the way competition and things are modeled. But essentially it's biomass removal, which either makes the plant smaller and then to some degree then can also cause mortality if you have low enough biomass.
Well, thanks a lot, Martin. And I think there's some additional parts of that question you can answer in the chat. And with that, it's time. I think we should move on to our next speaker, who's Will Janousek. And Will's going to talk about patterns and practical tools managing the interplay of habitat quality and temperature on mule deer demographics. So, Will, I see you. I see your slides, and I hear you. So take it away.
Great. Yeah, appreciate you putting this together for all of us to share some of the science we've been doing. My name is Will Janousek. I'm a biologist out of the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, and I am here to talk today a little bit about some of the work we've been doing with mule deer. It's been a large range of projects that encompass very large data sets over many years, and there's multiple phases to that. So I'm going to walk through some of those different phases and then kind of catch up on what we're working on currently, some tools and products that are coming out. Central to this question, though, is this idea of changing demographics in mule deer across the state of Wyoming. And one of those ways that the state measures population performance, if you will, is this concept of age ratios. This is the number of fawns to adult does, and that changes over time. It has been changing since the 1980s, slowly decreasing over that 40-year period. Just for reference here, so you're looking at this figure on the right, age ratios of 1 would indicate 1 fawn per each adult doe. So it's like a replacement kind of level of reproduction. Less than 1 is less than replacement. And then a decline obviously would indicate some issues in the population writ large. There is year-to-year variation in those different herd units. These different subpopulations of mule deer move together as conditions improve or get worse. And you can kind of see that in the figure itself. But really the bigger goal here is to link habitat to these changes in population demographics, because habitat, however you want to define that, is one of the mechanisms that we have through management to affect change in populations. And so there was a big project, first phase of this assessment. All of this is working under the Wyoming Landscape Conservation Initiative program, WLCI work. This looked particularly at habitat characteristics on winter use areas over that full 40-year time frame. It's a very broad scale assessment looking at the impacts of different management treatments as well as other large landscape features. That paper just came out, Hayes et al. 2026 in Ecological Applications, and there's a companion report, a BLM report, that talks about all the different, I would say, habitat features that were measured in that analysis and how those have changed over time, giving this much kind of long-term historical perspective, but also focused kind of tightly on winter use areas. What I'm more talking about today is some of the work that I've been doing that is assessing more fine-scale habitat selection using GPS collar data from across the state and across multiple populations and across seasons. So we're looking at both habitat use in the summer as well as habitat use in the winter. And we build a series of resource selection models from this to then predict habitat suitability and ultimately inform the trend and age ratios that we kind of talked about early on the first slide. But to phrase that in a different way here, so we use mule deer GPS data to build resource selection models. From those resource selection models, we can predict habitat suitability across the broader geographic region, in this case across the state of Wyoming. And then once we couple that habitat suitability with other abiotic factors like drought conditions, winter severity, we can start to get a more comprehensive picture about what's driving those demographic changes in tandem. So is summer habitat more important than winter habitat? Are both of those more important than winter temperatures? And so all of those things we can look at in tandem. So to build these models, we're using roughly 1,500 GPS collared female mule deer over 22 years, from 2001 to 2022, across the state. And we do so in a kind of hierarchical sense where we built regional models for habitat selection. And each region has a model for summer and winter, and those are each comprised of multiple mule deer herds that have GPS collared data. And we do this because we understand that across the state, the resources are different for these different populations of mule deer. And so you can imagine deer living in the western portion of the state in a more mountainous region encounter a much different landscape than those, say, in the eastern portion of the state. And that's kind of what we're looking at here in this figure. And because resource availability is different across those geographic regions, the level of selection for particular aspects of habitat, land cover, et cetera, can be different. And so we want to model those separately to account for those variation in essentially choice by deer for the places that they choose to live in. Is a little bit more in-depth looking at the data sets. So each one of these points is a deer that had a GPS collar on it. The points represent the centroid, or the center of their home range. But just to kind of give you a sense of the spatial proximity of these and kind of where they are on the landscape. So this is our summer region. So we had 3 regional models for the summer regions, and then 4 regions for winter, mostly because those deer in the western U.S., in the western Wyoming, are pretty much predominantly migratory, and so they move from the mountains down into the valleys in the Front Range in winter. The eastern portions of population, they do have migratory individuals, but less so than that western half. And so I'm going to skip through like all the model selection. There was a lot of work that went into this and to build out these models. And I just want to show you a couple key results just to kind of get our minds thinking of why this approach is the way we chose. And I think the results demonstrate that. So if we just look here at this graph, this is showing the responses to different land cover features by mule deer in terms of selection. So if it's a negative, they're avoiding that characteristic. If it's a positive effect, they're selecting for it. And we can see that the main point here is that there's variation across these different regions, and that occurs in both summer and winter. In some regions, there's stronger affinity for instance, non-sage shrub cover, which is a dietary component during the summer months. Avoidance of sagebrush, which they typically don't eat during summer. Avoidance of areas with annual invasive annual grass, and so forth. And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time just going through each one of these. If you're interested, this paper's out, and so we can dive into those results more in depth. Our goal here was to build, defensible, biologically realistic resource selection models based on the vast majority of the literature, because these populations have been studied. I mean, we mentioned this data comes from 22 years of GPS collar data, which those individual studies have all kind of worked out what are the main features of the landscape that mule deer select for. And so we kind of compiled all of that into these models, but trying to account for the difference in selection that occurs across the range. We see the same thing in winter too. So just to underlie that, we see variation in the pieces of land cover that are selected for and the strength that different populations select for those land cover features. Sagebrushes tends to be more selected for during winter, becomes a dietary component in the wintertime. And then landscape, topographic features, all sorts of things are in this model to help kind of inform the localized aspects for our predictions. We'll say that we use another sub-analysis to look at the avoidance of oil and gas, and that I guess rings true. That's not a surprising result from the assessments, given the range of research on mule deer and oil and gas, particularly in winter range, but also in summer, and we see avoidance regardless of the season. One just mention here, and so part of what came out of this work is the development of a time-stamped oil and gas data set that is available online, and I have a slide later that kind of links to that, but I just want to kind of plug that here. This is showing a really generalized version of that spatially, but what it does is allows anybody to pull up the well data, oil and gas well data from the state of Wyoming and look at in 2022 where were all the active wells and build some products from that if you're interested. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. The main point is we have all of these different covariates that go into these resource selection models, and we use those then to make predictions about habitat. So we use all of those relationships across the different different portions of Wyoming to integrate into a single prediction of habitat suitability that is produced annually. Right now, you're just kind of seeing the average across time. But from that, we can get more specific information too about like the consistency of habitat being suitable in a particular area. And so if we look at the bottom slide, the bottom figures here, especially in summertime, you can see the variation across space in terms of areas of the landscape that are consistently suitable and then areas of them that are less so. And that varies year to year, varies by space, driven a lot by difference in temperature and land cover. And so I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit here. So we use these landscape features to predict our age ratios, essentially, both summer habitat, summer temperature, winter habitat, and winter temperature. And all of these interact in different ways, but not, I guess, maybe not surprising to us here. We see that the temperature components have much stronger influences on age ratios than the actual habitat availability, which indicates to us that we can do management levers of control on summer habitat, for instance, restoration. But in looking forward, the impacts of hotter temperatures and cold events, that's important. So warmer winters is better, but we're seeing more frequent periods of like extreme cold events, and that's having a negative impact on our populations. And I think I'm getting close to time because I think John's popped up here. So I'll end on this slide so you can kind of get to some information on our new products that are coming out, these different data layers. And there's a series of R packages that are going to be available to basically visualize and understand how you might be able to implement some of these products into your management workflows. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Will. That's a great comprehensive synthesis analysis of that, having these incredible data sets and putting them to good use. You all are doing some wonderful work there in Wyoming on that front and helping develop these tools that others are able to use with their, state-based data sets or whatever. It's great stuff. I didn't
Too much to talk about in 10 minutes.
That's okay, but thank you for finding a good stopping spot here. I think we got time for one question. I don't see any, so I'm going to ask you. You highlighted the challenges of these sort of extremes and weird cold weather events in the winter and hot events in the summer. So what are some possible adaptation strategies that maybe come to mind? And I know that's getting a little bit outside of where we typically go, but I'm sure you've thought about it. So I'd love to hear your
From a mule deer perspective or from
yeah,
like an
from a mule deer. Yeah, for management for mule deer.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because mule deer are fairly fixed in their selection patterns. And so whether they have the ability to change those in a shorter time period is a question that I don't have an answer for. What we're really seeing is kind of how can you target restoration in such a way that you can kind of buffer these other climatic factors. So producing more drought tolerant restoration, or bringing that into the workflow, plants that not only can survive in drought environment, but also maybe help prevent soil evapotranspiration to keep soil moisture intact.
Yeah.
And this all dovetails into some of the earlier talks we've heard today about, sagebrush ecological integrity. Like all of that plays into this.
Right.
But yeah, interesting enough though that it's less. So we can think about it in terms of summer and vegetation, but when it comes down to winter, it's really that like those cold, those extreme cold events that are, I think, driving those age ratios down more so than habitat. And can you balance those scales? I think that's the question that we'll see moving into the future.
Yeah, some interesting challenges for sure. Well, thank you for sharing. Really appreciate it. Robert Arkle's here, and he's going to talk about effects of fire and post-fire restoration seeding treatments on mammals in the sagebrush steppe. So I got your slides, Robert. I saw you for a second. I don't right now, though.
Yeah, can you hear me?
There you go, and I hear you.
Right.
All right, take it away.
Excellent. Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone for joining in today. There's been some great talks. I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that we started quite a few years ago, and then we set it down for 15 years or so. But with Savannah's help, we're excited to have some of it recently published, and some other aspects are in review. First study I'm going to tell you about was recently published in Rangeland Ecology and Management, and it's in this one we looked at the effects of fire and restoration on rodent species in sagebrush habitats. So rangeland fires not only change the vegetation on the landscape, but they represent a really rapid and substantial change in habitat for all kinds of different animals. Going from shrubland to a charred area without much biomass, and then from there, either to a non-native annual system or to a native perennial grassland. So to try and prevent that state transition, we all know a lot of post-fire seedings are implemented. A really high percentage of burned areas every year are treated under the ESNR program. And these areas are often treated with either non-native perennial grass seedings, things like crested wheatgrass, or with native seed mixes, usually things like blue bunch wheatgrass. So these fires and then subsequent treatments in them obviously alter habitats for mammals, especially really small ones like rodents who can't move long distances to get to unburned habitats further outside of fire perimeters. So species like the least chipmunk, the Paiute ground squirrel, and the Great Basin pocket mice that you see here are important on these landscapes as herbivores, as granivores, and as prey for larger mammals and for reptiles and birds as well. Some of them even function as ecosystem engineers, like the ground squirrels whose burrows and tunnels can create lots of habitat for other species to use. So we wanted to assess how fires and then seedings impact habitats, rodent richness, and species habitat associations. So we've seen a lot of work done on things like this with sage grouse, but not so much for small mammals and larger grazers in the sagebrush. So way back in 2009, we sampled 71 plots at these three sites, these three fires in southern Idaho that were between 2 and 14 years old post-fire at that time. We had plots that were burned and seeded with natives, burned and seeded with non-natives, control plots that were burned and left unseeded, and then we sampled plots in unburned reference areas around each of these three fires as well. So we looked at vegetation cover on each plot, and we put out grids of 25 Sherman traps for 3 nights at each plot. And traps were baited with peanut butter and oats. You can see that bait ball here, along with a sagebrush bowl and a beetle that we caught in the trap. You can also see how long ago 2019 was, back when my hat brim was still wider than my waistline. So what did we find other than I've put on a few pounds over the years? Not surprisingly, the main difference in vegetation was the lack of shrub cover in any of these burned areas. Within 14 years of fire, the shrubs just weren't providing much habitat in the burned areas, regardless of treatment. But when we looked at all of the understory species together in this ordination plot, we saw that there were some differences due to treatment. And many of the red points are plots that were burned and left untreated, and many of them are dominated by non-native annual grasses. The burn points are plots that were seeded with natives, and a lot were dominated by native perennial grasses. Not all of them, but a good amount were. The blue points are plots that were seeded with non-natives like crested, which dominated along with bare ground cover in those areas. The unburned plots in the purple kind of spanned this range of conditions in the understory, but none were dominated by cheatgrass, fortunately. When we overlaid the rodent species abundances on here, we found that American deer mice, Great Basin pocket mouse, and the least chipmunk were most likely to occur in these unburned reference plots, although deer mice showed a little bit of an affinity for areas that were seeded with natives. So these are the shrubland species, and they're the ones that are likely going to kind of lose out due to wildfire. The pipe ground squirrels, northern grasshopper mouse, and Ord's kangaroo rat were more associated with um, burned plots, and a little bit with burned and seeded with non-natives, kind of secondarily. So these are species that are likely going to win after wildfire if cheatgrass increases or if areas are seeded with things like crested. And then last, the sagebrush vole was most likely to occur in areas that were burned and seeded with natives, like blue bunch. So seeding those kind of things is probably going to help that species out as long as not too many non-native grasses move in. So I'd be happy to give more details about this work. This is just the gist of it. So reach out if you'd like. But our three takeaways from the small mammal portion of the work are that the wildfire substantially reduced shrub cover for at least 14 years. Post-fire seedings did establish perennial grasses, whether they are native or not. And as far as rodent species, there were winners and losers, and this particular species turnover pattern depended on the habitat preference of each species. But what about the larger mammals? So this is some work that is in review right now at Restoration Ecology. At those same three sites that we just looked at for rodents, we also did some belt transects for large mammal scat. We were able to do these scat or pellet belt transects at 6 other sites in Oregon, some over in the Steens, some over by the Owahis, and a couple by the Malheur and Snake. We had the same kind of sampling design there, unburned reference plots, burned untreated controls, and then non-native seeding, native seeding. And then we were able to get to a lot more plots. 222 of them were surveyed, and we were looking for pellets belonging to 4 taxa, pronghorn, deer, which we combined the 2 possible species, and lagomorphs, which were 2 different species of cottontails or jackrabbits, and finally cattle. So we detected 12,270 total pellet groups, which is a lot of poop. And we fit resource selection function models for each of those taxon and found out which habitat elements they were keying in on. And we projected that out to our 4 different treatment categories, which showed that pronghorn used burned areas that were seeded with natives as much as they used unburned areas, and more than they used the other 2 areas. So that kind of tells us that seeding natives provided favorable conditions for pronghorn, even if the areas were not completely restored to pre-fire conditions. Deer followed a similar pattern to pronghorn. They used native seedings just as much as they used unburned areas, and somewhat more than the controls or non-native seeding areas. And cattle used non-native seedings more than the unburned areas, which makes sense. And it also shows us that the native and non-native seeding treatments can have different outcomes for wild and domestic ungulates. And then lagomorphs, the rabbits, were the only taxon to use a single area more than each of the other three. They used these unburned areas more than all other of the burned areas, regardless of seeding. So like with the rodent analysis, there's a lot more details about the habitat elements that these larger mammals are keying in on. If you'd like more info on that, reach out to me and I'll try and fill you in. But our takeaways here are that the post-fire seeding decisions can result in divergent resource use by wildlife versus livestock, where pronghorn were preferring native seedings and cattle, the non-natives. Rabbits were likely to lose out due to wildfire. And then last, the pellet surveys can be kind of a coarse but efficient way to monitor these post-fire restoration areas for use by grazers. That's all I have for you today. Thanks a bunch.
Great, Robert. Thank you very much. One question came up from George Peck in the chat. George was curious if you had any data on invertebrates like native pollinators. I know you've done some work in that arena.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do have a lot of work that we've done with native pollinators in different places in southern Idaho. Probably the most comprehensive is on the Soto wildfire, which burned in 2015 on the Idaho-Oregon border. We looked at pollinator use in similar treatment categories and in relation to which forbs were available or which were seeded in those locations.
Yeah.
So
another question popped up from Corey, if you can see that, or I can read it for you. Why do you think there were differences between native ungulates and cattle use? Avoiding each other?
I think perhaps avoiding each other or just palatability of the different plants for the different different groups there. Hard to say based on what we did with the pellets. We didn't have a lot of temporal assessment of when those deposits were made, things like that. Some of those details, like you saw with Will's work, where they're collecting GPS points and can get at a lot more mechanistic type information.
And cattle are certainly more generalists. They've been domesticated for that, so that might be part of it too. I was wondering, given the decadal changes in your small mammal work in those sites, and also though that we have much improved seed mixes and seeding techniques, would you expect to find any real differences from those older results?
That's a good question. I think that there's so much interannual variability in the weather conditions during seeding that a lot of times those factors can maybe outweigh some of the newer methodologies being employed and things like that. And we did have quite good success of establishment of the seeded species, big fairly substantial reductions in non-native cover in places that were treated. So I think they were effective treatments overall. So hopefully, some of the animal patterns that we observed out of that would still be relevant.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Robert. In the interest of sort of keeping a schedule, even though we have a little more time today, I want to respect that we had limited time for direct questions for the other speakers as well. And we'll go ahead and wrap up today's seminar a little early since Bill's not available. But I want to thank all the speakers and all the great presentations that you shared. We really appreciate, again, these opportunities to get you all in front of a management audience and your peers as well. This is an opportunity that we really enjoy bringing to everyone, and we will be continuing next week with our remaining sessions, which include on the 15th, our invasive species theme, and then on the 16th, we have monitoring, and on the 17th, fire So if you haven't registered for those, please do. Corey just dropped that link. And again, thank you to Janae and Corey for the support for this webinar series.
Thanks, John. And just a quick plug, after the webinar ends, there'll be a 3-question survey. It really helps us out if you answer it. So I appreciate that. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. See you next time.